Welcome to the War Academy channel. When talking about military decision-making, in the different German operations of the Second World War, Hitler's meddling in all of them is always valued. As everyone knows, Hitler's power within the German army increased little by little throughout the entire conflict, until it became omnipresent. Today in this program we are going to analyze how and why Hitler gained total control of the army, and to what extent his generals deceived him or not with the reports they presented to him. When Hitler comes to power in early 1933, most of the top army officers have no particular sympathy for him. In other programs we could see Keitel's own opinion, which was shared by many of his colleagues, which did not leave Hitler in a very good place. Basically they considered him a populist on a political level, and a corporal on a military level. In addition, there was another concern within the German army, this being that of being replaced by the SA as the official army of the Reich. After finishing with the main leaders of the SA, and thus ending this internal dispute, Hitler won the trust of the high command of the German army. From this point on, they began to see him as someone who was going to rebuild and make the German army great again. Obviously, it's the same thing they wanted, so he began to warm up to him. Already in August 1934, the Hitler Oath was established for all the soldiers of the army, who no longer swore allegiance to Germany, but to Hitler himself. This oath read thus: "I swear to God this sacred oath, that I owe unconditional obedience to the leader of the German Empire and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, and that as a brave soldier, I will be prepared at all times to defend this oath with my life." From this point, both diplomatic and military victories began to occur unstoppably. In 1936 the Rhineland was remilitarized. In 1938 Austria was annexed, and by the beginning of 1939 Czechoslovakia fell. All these events also carried out without firing a shot, made Hitler gain more and more prestige before everyone. When he gave the order to prepare an armed campaign against Poland, many alerts went off within the German High Command, because contrary to popular belief, the German army was not prepared in 1939 for a large-scale armed conflict. The forecasts that had been marked in their military production plans was that they would not be completely ready until at least 1945 or 46. After the successful campaign over Poland, Hitler gave the order to prepare to attack France as soon as possible. Let us remember that at this time Germany was at war with France and Great Britain, before the Allied declaration of war in early September, in an attempt to defend Poland. It was here that all the alarms really went off within the German High Command, which saw this action as authentic madness. Beating a poor country like Poland had been easy. Even more so with Soviet support, and the excellent German starting points that had made it possible to attack the Polish rear. But launching against France, Holland, and Belgium, to which part of the British Army also joined, were big words. As if that were not enough, in this campaign they had no choice but to make a frontal attack, either against the Maginot Line or against Belgium, which would almost certainly stall. As a final shot, they had the danger in their rear, as it was speculated that the Soviets would launch against them as soon as the Western Front bogged down. What we are going to see next is one of the main elements that will catapult Hitler towards an absolute authority within the German army. It all had to do with the plan that was finally chosen to attack France. Halder, Chief of General Staff of the Army High Command at the time, had planned everything to attack through Belgium, in an operation very similar to that of the First World War. Manstein's proposed plan to pass through the Bulge and encircle most of the Allied armies had been ignored. When, by chance, Hitler meets Manstein in person, and Manstein tells him about his plan, Hitler seizes Manstein's plan and imposes it on Halder. Halder reluctantly has to accept it, and when he begins to study it thoroughly, he realizes more and more that he is a better option. When the French campaign ends in absolute triumph, in which in just 40 days the Germans achieve something that was not thought possible, Hitler's prestige rises to the sky. At this point, high-ranking officers like Halder, who hadn't initially bought into the plan, suffer significant discredit from Hitler. In the future they will have to work to get it back. In any case, Hitler convinces himself that he is superior to many of his generals, and when the time comes, the decisions he can make himself are going to be much better. As Hitler gains power and confidence in the field of military strategy, he bears less the dissenting opinions of his generals, and is very aggressive with them in the face of the slightest criticism. This situation is causing fewer and fewer generals who dare to contradict him. From the end of 1940, and until the middle of 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was taking shape, the authority of the German leader was imposing itself. At first, the reports that arrive about the situation of the German army are very discouraging. To put it succinctly, everything was missing. The fuel reserves would hardly last for a few weeks of offensive. There was not enough tank production to form new panzer divisions, nor to cover replacements. Manpower was lacking and military production could not be increased too much either. Food was also not something that was left over, and difficulties in this matter were also foreseen for the new campaign. To cite one last element, the Luftwaffe was very worn out, and its continued operations in the skies of Great Britain were not going to allow it to arrive with its full capacity for the invasion of the Soviet Union. These reports greatly incensed Hitler, and made him very angry with those generals who presented it to him. In some way he accused them of not having faith in his country or in his army, nor of course in him. It was from this moment on that the general habit of not informing Hitler with very hard data about the situation became widespread, and many limited themselves to telling him what the German leader wanted to hear. This in turn made them continue to have his approval and better consideration. Halder, for example, was one of them, since he wanted to recover the prestige he had lost in the French campaign. When the barbarous operation against the Soviet Union began, there were cases of generals who repeatedly disobeyed orders, as was the case with Guderian. These insubordinations had been allowed in previous campaigns, as long as the result of the operation ended well, but the same would not happen this time. After not being able to conquer the Soviet capital, Hitler gives a great reprimand to von Brauchitsch, which added to the criticality of the situation, makes him have a heart attack. Being the situation like this, Hitler appointed himself as commander-in-chief of the German army on December 19, 1941. Here again, an order from Hitler was reimposed in a blunt way, in which any withdrawal on the Eastern Front was prohibited. Given the criticality of the situation, this decision was correct, and once again the German leader convinced himself that while his generals failed him, he always made the right decisions. For the 1942 campaign he made it a point not to make the same mistakes again, and he had greater control over the military decisions that were made from the outset. This was precisely the reason why he began to appoint a series of generals who he knew would not act on their own, and who would obey him with total loyalty, as was the case with Paulus. Already during the first weeks of the Blue Operation, Hitler decided to modify it and divide his army in two, to take their objectives quickly and simultaneously. It was during these months that a series of resignations and dismissals took place, in which the commanders-in-chief of the German Group A and B, these being von Bock and Wilhelm List. Furthermore, Halder himself was also removed on September 24. None of these men would serve in a military position again for the rest of the war. A few weeks later, when the Sixth Army was surrounded in Stalingrad, and with it, hopes of victory against the Soviet Union were lost, the information received by Hitler began to be more biased. Basically, they were given data that were half-truths, always based on the most optimistic version of the situation. To see it in detail, there is no better example than what happened with the air supply in Stalingrad. Firstly, when Hitler asked if it was possible to supply the Sixth Army using aviation, Hans Jeskonek, a senior Luftwaffe commander, got carried away and said yes. Without a doubt, it was customary to always give positive answers without having studied the subject in depth. When he subsequently did so, he wanted to rectify his opinion, but it was already too late, as Hermann Göring had already given Hitler a positive assessment of him as well. When the Stalingrad troops began to be supplied from the air, Hitler's table only received information on the amount of supplies sent, which was very different from what the troops finally received in the city. In other words, this report did not take into account the planes that did not arrive, nor the material that was thrown to the Soviets by mistake. With this, the information that Hitler had was totally wrong, and when this was pointed out to him by a young captain who was able to leave Stalingrad, the generals of Hitler's council were very furious. From this date in early 1943, the situation was getting worse for Germany, and few generals dared to report the situation without any embellishments, so the distance between reality and fiction was growing. As a final explanation, we can see it better with the following summary. The German leader did not want people to inform him of how bad everything was in detail, which in the end referred to some withdrawal or a search for negotiation. What he wanted is generals who, despite the criticality of the situation, would tell him that regardless of reality, they would manage to turn it around and end up winning. Well, so far this program in which we have tried to make a summary as complete as possible on this matter. We say goodbye here. Many thanks to everyone, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.